Hi there, it's the first Sunday of Advent, and I thought that I'd share a video reflection on the scripture readings that a lot of Christian churches will be looking at this Sunday. The first reading is from the Jewish scripture, from the book of Isaiah, chapter 64, verse 1 to 9. And the gospel reading is from Mark chapter 13, verse 24 to 37. So feel free to pause the video and have a read of those and then start it up again. Listening to today's readings, we might be thinking, isn't this supposed to be about the anticipation of Christmas? Where are the choirs of angels and the ringing of bells? Where are the presents and the roast dinners? The reading from the book of Isaiah describes an experience of desolation. The Jewish people had been defeated by their enemies and their land had been destroyed. Many people had been taken back to the land of their enemies. Today's reading comes from the experience of a later generation who had been able to return home, but who found that the land was still desolated and the city was still in ruins. And the prophet Isaiah is asking, where is God? Like, his experience is that God has turned away from them. He remembers the ancient Jewish stories of God rescuing the people from slavery in Egypt, and the stories of God's clear presence with the people as they were wandering in the wilderness, of God being represented to them by a fire and a cloud that was with them. And Isaiah asks, why is it not like that now? We might also ask, why did God allow the extermination of millions of Jewish people during the Third Reich, as well as Roma, as well as queer people, as well as people with disabilities and people who were involved in the resistance, like the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer? We might ask, why has God allowed the deaths and displacement of people by things like tsunamis and bushfires? We might ask, why is God allowing the massacre of Palestinian people by the Israeli Defense Force? Over 1,000 Israelis and over 15,000 Palestinians have died since the start of October. If God delivered people in the stories of the ancient past, why does God not do that now? Isaiah laments that God has been angry with the people and that the people have sinned, that God has withdrawn from them and they've gone the wrong way. It sounds like Isaiah is saying that God's anger and absence have caused the people to sin. In any case, God is pleading with God on behalf of the people, saying that they need God's presence so that God can guide them in the right direction. Their children needing God's care and instruction, or clay needing God's hands to shape them. Whoever is responsible for the break in relationship, they need to come back together. They need God to take a step toward them in the midst of their struggles. When we hear the gospel this morning, we might expect to hear about Mary and Joseph and the angels, the expectation of an unexpected baby. But what we hear in the gospel is apocalyptic. Why are we hearing this in the lead up to Christmas? It talks about the sun and moon being darkened and the stars falling from the sky, which sounds quite frightening. Mark's gospel comes to us from a community who remembered the Jewish rebellion against Rome and may have been part of the rebellion, and they would have been impacted by the devastation of being reconquered by the Romans. So we should not be surprised that some of the imagery we receive from them is frightening. They lived in a frightening world, as do many people in our world today. But it may be helpful to talk about some of the imagery and what it might mean. In that part of the ancient world, the stars and the other heavenly bodies were understood to be gods. This is why people have paid attention to the stars in order to interpret the times. The understanding has been that what happens in the skies, in the stars and the planets and the clouds, can tell us about what happens on Earth. So when we hear an ancient Christian text talking about the stars falling from the sky and the sun and the moon being darkened, it's talking about the fall of the cosmic powers at the return of Christ, who will establish a new order based on justice and fairness and wisdom. The fall of the old order, where they've been kept in their place and humiliated and killed, would have been good news for these people. The thing is, that's not what happened. The earliest Christians expected that Christ would return in the clouds with divine power in their lifetimes, but it didn't happen. Like Isaiah asking why God would not be present in the form of fire and cloud like in the past, ancient Christians would have questioned why Christ had not returned as expected in their lifetimes, and they would have felt abandoned. The German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was involved in resisting the Nazi regime, was asking this question as he waited in prison, waiting for his execution. Why did God not intervene in power against the Nazis? His conclusion was that God actually arrives among us as the crucified Christ. God is present with us in places of suffering. It's in the places of suffering and devastation that hope is born. Christ returns to us among those who suffer. We encounter the returned Christ among the millions killed by the Nazis, among the refugees who have no permanent home among us, among the first peoples who are struggling for their right to care for this country, among the displaced people of Ukraine and Palestine. It is in these situations that we search for the presence of the crucified Christ and the arrival of the reign of God. When we hear of these things happening in our world, we should know that Christ is close by, and we should be prepared to welcome Christ in whatever form Christ comes to us this Advent season.